Many are calling this the largest bubble in US history. Following 3 years of greed, speculation, and easy money, the US housing market is finally starting to show concerning fractures. While many on YouTube are quick to point out that prices remain high, fresh new data shows that we're entering a housing crash that could cause irreparable damage to the markets, with the strong possibility that this could end up worse than 2008. In today's video, we look at shocking new reports that indicate an uncertain, shaky future for the markets, eerily similar to what we were seeing in 2007 right before the big crash. To understand just how bad this can get, we first need to take a quick history lesson that will help us comprehend how economists and other speculators can predict the downfall before it happens. Now, obviously, nobody's Nostradamus, and even the best investors can be wrong, as seen with the 2008 crash, but by looking back at that period, we can learn from history. We know that during the last cycle, the housing bubble peaked in 2007. Specifically, prices peaked in the first quarter of that year. Now, at the time, nobody knew there was any trouble brewing. Well, almost nobody. At this exact time, the stock market was on its way up, the unemployment level was at a near decade low, and everything in the US looked incredible. Everyone who watched The Big Short knows that this time period was characterized by crazy speculation. Everyone and their neighbor had a house, maybe two, sometimes three. The requirements for a mortgage had become extremely lax, and ninja loans, or no income, no job loans, became extremely commonplace. If you wanted a mortgage, no matter your circumstances, all you had to do was pick up the phone and call an originator. So knowing this, where were the signs? Was there any data to show that a massive problem was brewing? Well, as it turns out, there were some pretty reliable forward-looking indicators that showed issues were developing long before everything went downhill in 2008 and 2009. And as we go through these stats, you'll see the similarities to what is happening right now. The first and most obvious one is housing starts, or the number of homes that have begun construction in the United States. You see, way back in February of 2006, one whole year before housing prices peaked, this number was also at a record high. For 12 straight months, housing starts fell off a cliff, going down by around 30% up to this point. As the entire bubble popped and things went completely haywire, this number would end up decreasing by 80%. So while the market was unaware and prices were just starting to turn, this indicator was flashing red, letting everyone know something was wrong. It reliably warned investors for over a year that bad times were ahead. In fact, outside of this stat, there's another reliable indicator that we can look at for an even earlier alarm detecting trouble more than a year and a half before prices peaked in February of 2007. Now that we know that construction starts are correlated with housing price crashes, we can use this information to bundle multiple pieces of data to build our bearish case. In the US, to start building a single-family home, you are required to get a permit. Turns out various agencies track the number of permits pulled, so if we look at the number of permits pulled for single-family units, we can get a rough idea in regards to the number of homes that will be built in the following year. And as you can see, single-family permits peaked in September 2005, 17 months before we saw a peak in prices. This number would decline 40% by this time right here, and would go on to decline nearly 82% when things finally bottomed out in January of 2009. So in essence, permits are an even earlier indicator of bad times ahead, and during the Great Recession they flashed red well before things got bad. Now with all that said, we can take a look at the current situation and examine it through the lens of 2008, knowing what we know about the past crash. What many will find surprising is that according to the US Census Bureau, home prices have still yet to peak. While we have seen a slowdown in growth over the last 2 quarters with indicators that may suggest we are approaching the apex, it may take up to 2 more quarters before we see a number with negative growth suggesting a peak. The next release is due on November 23rd, and it's expected to be even higher than the Q3 number. But remember, we are going after forward-looking indicators. The price, it always takes months, sometimes years, to catch up to the reality happening on the ground right now. Don't forget that home starts in the 2008 crash started dropping off a cliff even as home prices continued to rise. So with all of that said, let's take a look at single-family construction right now. After peaking in December of 2020, the numbers have already declined 33%. While on a chart, this may not look as dramatic as the 2007 numbers because of the difference in volume and the fact that we haven't seen the whole thing play out. Relatively speaking, we are already seeing the same type of decline we saw in the initial phases of the 2008 crash. To support this theory, we can also look at permits like I mentioned earlier, and just like starts, starts, they are also dropping off a cliff. After peaking earlier this year in February, single-family permits are in a steep decline, dropping over 30% in 8 short months. Like I mentioned in the 2008 crash, permits declined from September 2005 to January 2009. That's over 3 years, and right now, according to the current chart, we are just 8 months in. While we can't be sure that this decline will be as steep as the last one, we can definitely forecast the future based on a number of other indicators. For example, the University of Michigan publishes this incredible chart, the buying conditions for a house. This data goes back 50 years to the 1970s, and right now buying conditions are worse than 2008. In fact, they're at their lowest level ever, lower even than what we saw in the early 80s. If you notice, each time this chart has dipped down here, we are either entering a recession or in one. Now remember, back during these times, interest rates were as high as 18%, contributing to these so-called unfavorable buying conditions. Today, the rate is at 5%, and we are already down here while unemployment remains extremely low and house prices remain at near record highs. If the Fed is forced to raise rates even further and unemployment soars because of this incoming recession, it's reasonable to assume that prices would come down and this chart would return to its historical average. In fact, the Federal Reserve makes it no secret that they believe the housing market has gotten out of hand and it's their duty to return it back to normal. In essence, this is essentially them saying they're going to purposely slow the market by increasing rates. Jerome Powell held a press conference just 2 weeks ago where he directly acknowledged this. You can hear him say it in this shocking clip. But before I show you, please take a second to hit that like and subscribe button if you're enjoying the video thus far. Now back to the clip.
I would say if you're a home buyer, somebody or a young person looking to buy a home, you need a bit of a reset. We need to get back to a place where supply and demand are back together, and where inflation is down low again, and mortgage rates are low again. So this will be a process whereby we do our work in a way where the housing market settles in a new place and housing availability and credit availability are at appropriate levels.
So with all of that said, here is the reality. Back in 2008, we had various signs that the housing market would turn. One of the clearest was housing starts and housing permits. Those two things began to turn almost a whole year before housing prices peaked, and after that, the housing market would slowly grind down for years. In some markets, it would take more than a decade to recover to 2007 prices. Now, with all of that said, today we are witnessing the same downfall in permits and starts, although based on the '08 decline, we are only getting started. While we have not seen home prices technically climax, it's believed that with all of these bad indicators, they will very soon, with the University of Michigan recording the worst buying conditions in US history and the Fed aggressively raising rates, openly talking about, quote, normalizing the market. It's become rather clear that things will get cheaper and the market could very easily crash harder than when it did in '08. At what cost this will come, nobody knows, but the truth is in the data. Whether you agree or not, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for watching, and please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down below.